Nikola Tesla, the Lord of Lightning, invented the alternating current system that powers our modern world, yet died completely alone while dreaming of free wireless energy for all mankind. His name is surrounded by more myths than any other scientist in history. Nikola Tesla, a man who, according to legend, was born during a violent lightning storm. They called him the Lord of Lightning, a genius who was a century ahead of his time, and a madman whose ideas bordered on magic. But who was he really? Was he a misunderstood prophet who could have given humanity free and unlimited energy but was stopped by greedy corporations? Or was he more of a tragic figure, a genius whose mind was ultimately consumed by his own grandiose but unrealizable fantasies? In this story, we will walk his amazing and tragic path. We will witness the great war of the currents, his relentless clash with another titan, Thomas Edison. We will step into his lonely laboratory in Colorado Springs, where he created artificial lightning dozens of feet long, and where, according to his own claims, he received signals from extraterrestrial civilizations. We will uncover the truth about his most ambitious and catastrophic dream, the gigantic Wardenclyffe Tower, which was supposed to change the world forever, but became the symbol of his greatest failure. And finally, we will try to unravel the mystery of his final years, spent in solitude in a New York hotel, and we will find out why, immediately after his death, FBI agents confiscated all of his files. This is not just a story about inventions and patents. It is the story of a mind that operated on another frequency, the story of a man who saw the future with such clarity that his present felt like a prison, a journey into the world of electric dreams, brilliant intuitions, and the unfulfilled hopes of Nikola Tesla. The story of Nikola Tesla begins in the small remote village of Smiljan, located in the territory of the then Austrian Empire, today Croatia. He was born on the night of July 9th to the 10th, 1856. According to a family legend, his birth was accompanied by one of the most violent lightning storms the region had ever seen. The sky was torn apart by lightning, and deafening thunder roared. The midwife, frightened, whispered in horror, "This child will be a child of darkness." To which Tesla's mother, Georgina, a strong and poetic woman, calmly replied, "No, he will be a child of light." This legend, true or not, became a prophecy for his entire future life. His father, Milutin Tesla, was an Orthodox priest. He was an educated, well-read man who owned a large library. He dreamed that his son would follow in his footsteps and also dedicate his life to the service of the church. His mother, Georgina, was the daughter of a priest, but unlike her husband, she was illiterate. However, it was she, according to Tesla himself, who was the source of his genius. Georgina possessed an incredible memory. She knew thousands of Serbian folk epic poems by heart, and most importantly, she was a born inventor. She created mechanical devices for the home and for her loom herself, constantly improving and simplifying her work. From his father, Tesla inherited discipline and a love for knowledge. From his mother, a rich imagination and the gift of invention. From his early childhood, it was evident that Nikola was an unusual boy. He possessed a photographic and eidetic memory. He could memorize entire books, word for word, and reproduce them years later. He saw the world in a different way than others. Any thought, any idea in his head instantly turned into a three-dimensional, vivid, and detailed image. He could assemble any device, however complex, in his imagination. Turn it on, check how it worked, make corrections, and disassemble it again without touching a single real tool. This unique gift, the ability of visual thinking, would become his main working tool for the rest of his life. But this gift also had a dark side. In his childhood and youth, he was hounded by strange and uncontrollable visions. Often, extremely bright flashes of light would appear before his eyes, completely eclipsing the real world. Any spoken word could evoke the detailed image of the object in his mind. These visions were so realistic that he often could not distinguish an imaginary object from a real one. To cope with this chaos, he began to develop incredible willpower and self-control within himself. His childhood curiosity knew no bounds and often led him to the brink of life and death. On one occasion, he decided to test the principle of flight. by jumping from the roof of a barn with an open umbrella and miraculously survived. On another, he tried to generate power using 16 beetles glued to a wooden rotor. His fascination with electricity began with a simple childhood experience. Petting his black cat on a dry, freezing day, he saw sparks jumping between his hand and the animal's fur. When he asked his father what that was, he explained that it was the same as lightning in the sky, only smaller. This idea, that the great and terrifying force of nature could be tamed and contained in a small everyday phenomenon, moved him to his very core. His father insisted on a church career, but NIKOLA dreamed of engineering. The turning point came when he was 17 years old. He fell seriously ill with cholera and was on the brink of death. The doctors had already given up on him. And then, in a moment of desperation, his father, sitting by his bedside, made him a promise. If you survive, you will go study at the best polytechnic institute in Europe. Later, Tesla would say with irony that it was precisely that promise that saved his life. He recovered miraculously. His father's word was law. After his recovery, Tesla was sent to study at the Graz University of Technology in Austria. There, he dives headfirst into the world of physics and mathematics. He studies 19 hours a day. He sleeps from 2 to 4 hours, astonishing the professors with his abilities. It was here, in his second year, during a physics class, that a key event occurred. The professor was demonstrating a Grama dynamo to the students, an imperfect direct current motor. It had brushes and a commutator that constantly produced sparks and required maintenance. Tesla, seeing this, stood up and declared that those brushes were a fundamental flaw, that a motor could be created that worked without them, with alternating current, using a rotating magnetic field. The professor mocked him. He dedicated an entire class to proving that this was impossible, that it was a perpetual motion machine. He told Tesla, "You may achieve great things, but you will never accomplish that." This challenge became a fixed idea for Tesla, an obsession. He abandons his studies in Graz, works for a while in Maribor, then enters Charles University in Prague. But all his thoughts are occupied by one single thing, the rotating magnetic field. The solution comes to him suddenly, like a divine revelation. In 1882, in Budapest, while working at the telegraph company, during a walk in the park with a friend, he was reciting some verses from Goethe's Faust, and suddenly, like a lightning bolt, the solution presented itself to him, complete, a ready and finished scheme. Immediately, with a stick in the sand, he drew the diagrams of his alternating current asynchronous motor. "Look how it works," he shouted to his astonished friend. In that moment, the technology that would change the world was born. But the world didn't know it yet. In Europe, nobody was interested in his idea. And then Tesla makes a decision that will change not only his life, but the future of the entire planet. He decides to go to America, to New York, to see the only man in the world who, he believed, could appreciate his genius. To Thomas Alva Edison. In 1884, Nikola Tesla, a 28-year-old Serbian engineer, landed in New York. In his pocket, he had only 4 cents, some poems of his own authorship, and one thing that was worth more than all the money in the world: a letter of recommendation. The letter was addressed to Thomas Alva Edison, the king of inventors, the wizard of Menlo Park, the most famous and influential man in the world of electricity. "Dear Edison," his former European colleague wrote, "I know 2 great men. One is you, the other is this young man." Tesla was going to meet his idol. Edison, at that time, was at the peak of his fame. He had just worked a miracle, illuminating an entire district of New York, Wall Street, with electricity, using his direct current system, or DC. His company, Edison General Electric, built power plants, laid cables, and manufactured light bulbs. He wasn't just an inventor, he was the founder of an entire industry. Edison received Tesla. He was a man of a completely different disposition, a pragmatist, a businessman, a genius of the trial and error method. He didn't believe in illuminations. He believed in thousands of experiments, in hard work. When Tesla, full of enthusiasm, began to tell him about his revolutionary idea of an alternating current motor, which would work without brushes or a commutator, Edison was skeptical. "All that is very beautiful," like poetry, he said, but completely impractical. Edison's entire empire was based on direct current. Alternating current wasn't just a different technology to him, it was a direct competitor, a threat to his entire business. However, he saw a brilliant practical engineer in Tesla and hired him for his laboratory. Tesla's task was not to create new systems, but to perfect Edison's old systems. He worked with incredible energy, often from 6 in the evening until 5 in the morning, repairing and improving the inefficient direct current dynamos. Edison was astonished by his working capacity. The culmination of their brief collaboration was the famous story, or legend, told by Tesla himself. Edison, facing serious problems with the generators of his ocean liner Oregon, jokingly promised Tesla $50,000, a huge sum for the time, equivalent to over $1 million today. If he managed to repair them, Tesla worked for several days without sleep and completely redesigned the defective machines, making them work perfectly. When he went to see Edison to claim the promised reward, he laughed and said, "Tesla, you still don't fully understand American humor." Instead of the $50,000, he offered him only a small raise in salary. For Tesla, this was not a simple deception. It was the collapse of his American dream. He understood that to Edison, he would always be just an employee, a pair of golden hands, but never a partner. He quit immediately. The most difficult period of his life began. He was left alone in a strange city, without money and without work. To survive, the genius, who just a few months earlier was astonishing professors in Europe, was forced to work as a simple laborer. He dug ditches for laying the electrical cables of Edison's very own company, earning $2 a day. "My higher education," he would write bitterly later, seemed like a mockery. But even during that time, he didn't stop thinking about his main idea. He talked about his alternating current motor with the other workers. He drew diagrams in the dirt. His foreman, upon introducing him to some investors, helped him found his own company, the Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing. It seemed that luck was smiling on him again. He obtained several patents, developed and installed arc lighting systems in the streets, but the investors were only interested in the quick profit of lighting. His revolutionary idea of the alternating current motor didn't interest them at all. In the end, they simply threw Tesla out of his own company, leaving him with only worthless shares instead of money. He found himself on the street once again, and then, when he was at his lowest, an event occurred that changed everything. George Westinghouse became interested in his work. Westinghouse was the complete opposite of Edison. He was also a great inventor. He invented the air brake for trains and was a great industrialist. But unlike Edison, he was an engineer to his core, and he immediately understood that the future belonged to alternating current. Edison's direct current system was extremely inefficient. It could only be transmitted over short distances, no more than about a mile. To illuminate a large city, you had to literally seed it with dozens of power plants every few blocks. It was incredibly expensive. Alternating current, on the other hand, could easily be stepped up to high voltages using transformers, transmitted over hundreds of miles, almost without losses, and then stepped down again to a safe level for consumers. It was a much more efficient and cheaper system, but it had one major drawback. There was no reliable and simple motor that could run on it. And then Tesla appeared. Westinghouse, upon hearing about his patents, found him immediately and proposed a collaboration. He bought Tesla's patents for the alternating current system, including the brilliant induction motor, paying him a huge sum for the time. And most importantly, he offered him a job in his Pittsburgh laboratory and total freedom for his future research. For Tesla, this was the beginning of the real American dream. He finally obtained the resources and support to realize his ideas. For Edison, however, it was a declaration of war. He understood that Westinghouse and Tesla had created a technology that threatened his entire multi-million-dollar direct current empire. Thus began the Great War of the Currents, a ruthless, life-or-death battle that would decide what the electrical future of the entire planet would look like. The War of the Currents, which broke out in the late 1880s, was not a simple academic dispute among engineers about the advantages. It was a cruel and relentless battle for the future, for multi-million-dollar contracts, for the right to define what electrified America would look like. It was a war of capital, of ambitions, and of geniuses. On one side was Thomas Edison, the king of direct current, DC, a living legend whose financial empire, backed by the banker J.P. Morgan, had already strung its copper wires through the financial heart of New York. On the other, the bold tandem of Nikola Tesla, a visionary genius, and George Westinghouse, a pragmatic industrialist. Who had bet on a new and much more efficient technology, alternating current, AC? Edison, being not only a great inventor, but also an absolutely unscrupulous marketing genius, understood perfectly well that in a purely technological race, he was losing. His direct current system was extremely inefficient. The voltage could not be changed, and the current could only be transmitted over short distances, no more than a mile or so from the power plant. To light a large city, you literally had to dot it with dozens of bulky and expensive power plants. Tesla's system, based on the use of transformers that could easily step the voltage up and down, was incomparably more elegant, cheaper, and more powerful. Alternating current could be transmitted for hundreds of miles with almost no loss. Unable to win in a fair engineering fight, Edison decided to win the war in the minds of the public. He initiated one of the earliest and dirtiest smear campaigns in history. His strategy was simple and brutal. He decided to prove to the whole world that alternating current was a deadly danger, a killer current. He wanted the abbreviation AC to be associated in the mind of every American, not with progress, but with the word death. Edison and his engineers began to stage shocking public demonstrations that looked more like medieval executions. They would pay local children a few pennies to bring them stray dogs and cats. Then, before specially invited reporters and a crowd eager for a spectacle, they would place the unfortunate animal on a metal plate and apply an alternating current of 1,000 volts from a generator manufactured by Westinghouse's company. The animal would die in terrible agony. The next day's newspapers would come out with alarming headlines. Westinghouse's alternating current kills, dangerous to life. But Edison went even further. He secretly financed an engineer named Harold Brown, who, like a traveling circus performer, toured the country with his spectacle of death. He publicly executed calves and even old circus horses with alternating current in fairs and town squares, vividly demonstrating the lethal power of his competitors' technology. The culmination of this horrifying campaign was the invention and lobbying for the electric chair. Edison, who in public was a fervent opponent of the death penalty, secretly advised the New York state authorities, through his assistants, to use precisely alternating current for the first electrical execution in history. His calculation was cynical and simple. He wanted the execution to go down in history with the neologism to Westinghouse. To Westinghouse someone, and in 1890 it happened. The first and horribly botched execution of William Kemmler was carried out with an alternating current generator. The press was horrified by the brutality of the spectacle, and Westinghouse's name became firmly linked to that nightmare. Tesla and Westinghouse were horrified by these barbaric methods, but they were forced to respond. Westinghouse filed lawsuits, wrote endless rebuttals in the newspapers, proving that, with proper use and transformation, alternating current was absolutely safe. And Tesla, a man of showmanship and drama, decided to respond in his characteristic and unforgettable style. He began to give his own lectures, public demonstrations at Columbia University and across the country that looked more like the shows of a great illusionist or a magician's performance. He would stand on stage in an elegant and perfectly tailored tailcoat, tall, thin, with burning eyes. And before an astonished audience, he would pass an alternating current of hundreds of thousands of volts through his own body. The light bulbs in his hands would light up without any wires. His body would be enveloped in a harmless and flickering bluish glow, street Elmo's fire. He would hold glass tubes coated with phosphorus on the inside, and they would light up brightly, becoming the world's first fluorescent lamps. He demonstrated vividly, by his own example, that high-frequency alternating current was absolutely safe for the human body. He showed that electricity was not the murderous monster that Edison painted, but an obedient, almost magical and subtle matter, if its true nature was understood. The decisive battle in the War of the Currents was not fought in laboratories or on the pages of newspapers. but in the two largest and most prestigious projects of the era that were to define the technological face of the nation. The first was the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It was a grandiose event, the White City, which was to show the world all the achievements of American science, technology, and culture. The fight for the contract to light the fair became the main prize of the war. Edison's company, General Electric, backed by the full power of the Morgan Bank, submitted a huge, almost astronomical bid. Westinghouse, using the cheaper and incomparably more efficient technology of Tesla's polyphase alternating current, offered a price almost twice as low, and he won the contract. It was a triumph. On the opening night, the President of the United States pushed a button, and the entire White City was instantly flooded with the bright, clean, never-before-seen light of hundreds of thousands of light bulbs. Powered by 12 giant alternating current generators designed by Nikola Tesla, the system worked perfectly. The whole world saw the indisputable advantage of AC. It was a crushing and public humiliation for Edison. The second and final nail in the coffin of direct current was the project to build the hydroelectric power plant at Niagara Falls. It was the project of the century. The idea of using the gigantic, almost divine power of the falls to generate electricity had been in the air for a long time, but nobody knew how to transmit that energy over long distances. For example, to the booming industrial city of Buffalo, located about 22 miles away. Edison's system was categorically inadequate for this. The International Niagara Commission, which included the best scientists and engineers in the world, including the famous Lord Kelvin, studied all the proposals for a long time, and in the end, despite the enormous pressure from Edison's lobby, they chose the polyphase alternating current system, developed and patented by Nikola Tesla for the Westinghouse Company. In 1896, the Niagara hydroelectric plant was solemnly inaugurated. 10 of the most powerful generators in the world, built on the basis of Tesla's patents, began to produce electricity that flowed through the cables to Buffalo, lighting its homes and running its factories. The war of the currents was over. Alternating current had won. It won completely and irrevocably. It is precisely this technology that today, more than 100 years later, powers our entire world. From the light bulb in your room to the servers on which this video is running, Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse had achieved a total and unconditional victory. Tesla became a global celebrity. His portraits appeared on the covers of magazines. His lectures filled auditoriums. He was at the peak of his fame. He was recognized. He was rich. It seemed that only an even greater triumph, honors, and the Nobel Prize awaited him. But it was at that very moment, having achieved his main practical goal, that his restless, insatiable, and brilliant mind was already absorbed in a new idea, even more crazy and fantastic, an idea that, in the end, would lead him both to his greatest discoveries and to his total and tragic failure. After the crushing victory in the War of the Currents and the triumph at Niagara, the name of Nikola Tesla resonated all over the world. He became the living symbol of the new electrical age, the man who had tamed alternating current. His laboratory on Houston Street in New York was a place of true pilgrimage. Journalists came to see the miracle with their own eyes, investors to place their money profitably, and celebrities looking for thrills. The writer, Mark Twain, a close friend of Tesla, participated with childlike delight in his experiments, holding in his hands light bulbs that lit up without wires, and posing for photographs in which his body seemed to be pierced by electricity. Tesla was at the top. He could have rested on his laurels for the rest of his life, perfecting his alternating current system, receiving enormous royalties for his patents, and reaping the fruits of his fame. But his restless and insatiable mind was already far away. He was no longer interested in the simple and crude transmission of energy through copper wires. He considered it barbaric. He was captivated by a new idea, much grander, more elegant, and almost insane. The transmission of energy and information wirelessly through the Earth itself and its atmosphere. He was absolutely convinced that our planet was not just a rock, but a gigantic spherical conductor with its own electrical charge, if its resonant frequency could be found, in the same way a musician finds the resonant note on a string. and one began to pump energy with a powerful transmitter. That energy could be received anywhere on the globe, no matter how remote. For this, only a simple receiver with a ground connection would be needed. It was the dream of a wireless world, of free, clean energy accessible to all. But to verify this fantastic hypothesis, he needed completely different conditions than those of a densely populated New York full of interference. He needed solitude, altitude, and above all, ideal atmospheric conditions for working with ultra-high voltages. In May of 1899, after receiving generous funding from one of his wealthiest patrons, the hotelier John Jacob Astor IV, Tesla sets off for Colorado Springs. It was a strange, almost mystical place, a small town located on a high-altitude plateau over 6,500 feet above sea level at the foot of Pikes Peak. The air there was dry, rarefied, and heavily ionized, which made it an ideal conductor for electrical discharges. And most importantly, the area was famous throughout America for its incredibly powerful and frequent thunderstorms. In summer, storms occurred almost daily. Tesla wasn't going there to hide from the lightning. He was going to study it. He didn't just want to observe it. He wanted to learn how to create and control his own. Far from the city, on the deserted plateau, he built his new experimental station in record time. It was a strange structure, unlike anything known. A large wooden hangar, resembling a barn or an exotic temple, from the roof of which protruded a gigantic metal mast nearly 200 feet high, crowned by a large copper sphere, like a finger pointing to the sky. It wasn't just a laboratory, it was a gigantic and unprecedented lightning-making machine, tuned in resonance with the planet itself. Inside this hangar, in the half-light, was his most powerful and dangerous invention, a gigantic magnifying transmitter, which we today call a Tesla coil. It was a huge, humming, and crackling structure of copper windings, capable of generating ultra-high frequency alternating current and a voltage of 12 million volts. Here, in complete solitude, far from prying eyes, Tesla began his most famous and terrifying experiments. He worked mainly at night, when atmospheric interference was minimal. When he turned on his transmitter, the laboratory transformed into a scene from a science fiction novel, into the sanctuary of a mad genius. The air inside the hangar ionized and began to glow with a ghostly, bluish light. Nearby metal objects, tools, the nails in the walls, emitted hissing and crackling halos of Street Elmo's fire. Butterflies that accidentally flew in began to spin, dragged by the currents of ionized air, and their wings glowed in the dark. And from the top of the mast, into the black, velvety sky of Colorado, with a deafening roar that shattered the silence, giant, sinuous, and branching electric arcs shot out, artificial lightning bolts 100 to 160 feet long. The earth underfoot hummed and vibrated, and the residents of Colorado Springs, miles away from the laboratory, watched this incredible light show with a mixture of terror and awe. They saw how in their homes, the light bulbs turned on and off by themselves, without any connection, and how blue sparks jumped from the water faucets. Horses in the pastures panicked, feeling how the earth beneath their metal shoes sang and vibrated. Once, during one of the most powerful experiments, Tesla created a discharge so gigantic that it burned out the main generator of the local power plant, leaving the entire city without power and provoking the anger of the authorities. But his goal was not impressive special effects. He was taking precise and fundamental scientific measurements. With his sensitive instruments, he recorded for the first time in history the existence of standing waves in the Earth's crust, the so-called Schumann resonances, proving that the Earth actually vibrates like a bell at certain frequencies. He lit light bulbs wirelessly miles away from his tower, simply by sticking them in the ground. He confirmed his main and fantastic hypothesis. The Earth really could be used as a gigantic global energy conductor. And it was here, in this silence, in this solitude, in this electrical paradise, that the most mysterious event of his biography occurred. One night, while working with his ultra-sensitive receiver, tuned to pick up the slightest electromagnetic oscillations, Tesla, according to his own words recorded in his diary, began to pick up strange, rhythmic, and repetitive signals. They did not resemble the usual atmospheric interference from distant storms. They were clear, mathematically precise, and recurring sequences. 1, 2, 3. Tesla was shocked. He was a scientist to the core, not a mystic. He checked all the equipment. He ruled out all possible terrestrial sources of interference. But the signals repeated, and he came to the only conclusion that seemed possible to him. An astonishing conclusion. These signals were of artificial and intelligent origin, but they could not come from Earth. He was absolutely convinced that he, Nikola Tesla, in his lonely Colorado laboratory, had become the first human being in history to receive a signal from an extraterrestrial civilization, possibly from Venus or Mars. Today, scientists believe that Tesla probably picked up radio signals from distant stellar objects, pulsars, which had not yet been discovered at that time, or simply misinterpreted some complex atmospheric phenomenon. But to him, it was irrefutable scientific proof. He was on the verge of not only a technological revolution, but a cosmic one. After 9 months of incredibly intense, almost uninterrupted work, having exhausted all the funds allocated to him, and having collected invaluable and unique data, Tesla leaves Colorado Springs and returns to New York. He returns as an absolute conqueror, convinced he is right. He is ready for his main project, the final and most grandiose one. He is ready to build not just a simple laboratory, but a world system, a gigantic tower that would provide the entire globe with free wireless energy and instant communication. He was at the peak of his genius, about to make a scientific utopia a reality. He didn't yet know that, in reality, he was on the brink of his greatest and most crushing defeat. Upon returning from Colorado Springs in 1900, Nikola Tesla was not just a scientist. He was a prophet returning from the mountain with new tablets of the law. He was absolutely convinced that he stood on the threshold of the greatest technological revolution in human history. His experiments had proven to him that the wireless transmission of energy and information on a global scale was possible. Now he only needed one last step, to build not an experimental station, but a full-scale, fully operational tower, which would become the heart of his world system. This world system, in his imagination, was almost utopian. It was supposed to provide the whole world with several key things. First, the instant transmission of messages, texts, and images to anywhere on the planet. In essence, he was describing the wireless internet and mobile telephony 100 years before their invention. Second, the centralized broadcasting of music, news, and lectures throughout the world. Third, a precise navigation system for ships at sea. And finally, the most important and revolutionary thing, the transmission of electrical energy without wires. He dreamed of a world where anyone, anywhere on the planet, could simply stick a small receiver into the ground and get power to light their home or run their machines. It was the dream of the end of energy scarcity, of a world without borders and without poverty. To realize this grandiose project, he needed an investor, and Tesla turned to the most powerful and richest man of the era, the banker John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was the complete opposite of Tesla, not a dreamer, but a cynical pragmatist, a financial genius who built his empire on control, monopolies, and profit. Tesla, when presenting his project to Morgan, made a cunning move. He barely mentioned his main, socialist idea of free wireless energy. He knew that would frighten the banker, whose fortune was invested in copper mines and electrical grids. Instead, Tesla focused on what Morgan could understand, the monopoly of communications. He promised to create a world radio telegraph, a system that would allow the transmission of stock quotes, news, and private messages across the Atlantic faster than the submarine cable, which at that time was slow and unreliable. He convinced Morgan that whoever controlled this system would control all the world's information flows. Morgan, seduced by this prospect, agreed. He granted Tesla $150,000, a huge sum for the time, equivalent to several millions today, for the construction of the first station on Long Island near New York. In 1901, construction began. On a large plot of land, named Wardenclyffe, arose one of the strangest and most futuristic structures of its time. It was a gigantic openwork wooden tower, 187 feet high. crowned by a massive, mushroom-shaped copper dome 65 feet across. Beneath the tower, a complex root system of metal pipes sank deep into the earth, which was supposed to ensure contact with the Earth's crust. Next to the tower, a large brick building was constructed for the laboratory, filled with highly complex, custom-made equipment. Tesla was at the peak of his happiness. He personally supervised the construction, paying attention to every detail. He believed he was on the verge of his greatest triumph. But then, an event occurred that marked the beginning of the end. In December 1901, while Tesla's tower was still under construction, the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi, using a much simpler technology and, according to many, Tesla's own patents, achieved what he had promised Morgan. He successfully transmitted the first transatlantic wireless radio signal, 3 dots, the letter S in Morse code. For the whole world, it was a triumph. For Tesla, it was a catastrophe. Marconi had not only beaten him to it, he had done it cheaply and simply. His system was primitive. It could only transmit dots and dashes. Tesla's system was incomparably more complex and perfect. It could transmit voice, images, and energy. But to the investors, that didn't matter. Marconi had already transmitted the signal. He had proven that it was possible. And now, Tesla's project, with its grandiose and expensive tower, seemed excessive. Tesla, in a panic, writes to Morgan, explaining that his system is 1,000 times better, that he needs even more money to complete the construction and surpass Marconi. But Morgan, cold and calculating, had already lost interest. The main goal, the radio telegraph monopoly, was slipping from his hands. And Tesla's other main idea, which he finally confessed to Morgan, the idea of free wireless energy, terrified the banker. Legend has it that when Tesla explained to him that anyone could receive power for free, Morgan asked, "And where then am I going to put the meter?" The funding was cancelled. It was a death blow. Tesla was caught in a trap. The grandiose tower, his life's work, stood unfinished. There was no money. The workers were leaving. The creditors were suing him. He wrote desperate letters to Morgan, pleading, threatening, appealing to his honor. But the wall of silence was impenetrable. For several more years, Tesla tried to find new investors, but in vain. His reputation was damaged. He was considered a genius, but a dreaming genius, incapable of seeing his projects through to completion. Wardenclyffe Tower, his world system, his dream of a utopia, never became fully operational. It slowly rusted and deteriorated as a gigantic and ironic monument to the greatest unfulfilled dream. In 1917, during World War I, the United States government, fearing that German spies might use the tower as a landmark, ordered its demolition with dynamite. The failure of the Wardenclyffe project marked the end of Nikola Tesla as a great public inventor. He lost everything: his laboratory, his patents, his fortune, and most importantly, the trust of investors. He would never again receive serious funding for his projects. His long, slow descent into obscurity was beginning. Nikola Tesla never recovered from the crushing failure of the Wardenclyffe project. It wasn't just a financial collapse that stripped him of his laboratory, his patents, and his fortune. It was the collapse of his entire philosophy, of his almost religious faith that humanity was ready to receive his gift, the gift of unlimited, free energy. He, a genius, had offered the world a utopia, and the world, in response, simply turned its back on him. Preferring the usual wires and meters, he retreated into the shadows. He would never again build laboratories or grandiose towers. But his restless, tireless, and brilliant mind didn't stop working for a second. He simply moved his laboratory from the real world to the only place no one could take from him, to the only tower no one could demolish: his own boundless imagination. The last 30 years of his life, Tesla lived in New York, becoming one of its most famous and enigmatic attractions. He lived the life of an eccentric recluse, constantly moving from one luxury hotel to another, from the Waldorf Astoria to the Street Regis. And when the debts piled up to more modest ones, like the Governor Clinton, and finally to the Hotel New Yorker, where he spent the last decade of his life, he lived on credit, accumulating huge lodging debts. which sometimes, out of respect for his past merits and to avoid a scandal, were secretly paid by his former partner, George Westinghouse, or other industrial companies. His days were ruled by a strict, almost manic, and unchangeable routine that he had imposed on himself. He worked in his hotel room, which was at once his home, laboratory, and office, from morning until late at night. He continued to generate ideas at an incredible, almost terrifying speed, filling hundreds of pages with highly complex mathematical calculations, schematics and blueprints, but now they were mostly purely theoretical developments, which almost never reached the experimental prototype phase. He continued to patent his inventions, and there were many. Among them, there were quite practical and earthly things: an originally designed fountain, a speedometer for cars, improved bladeless turbines, and even the concept of what we today call a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. But increasingly, his mind, free from the need to solve practical problems, wandered into territory that bordered on science fiction. It was during this period that the legends about his most mysterious and terrifying superweapons were born. The most famous of them was the Peace Ray, which the press immediately dubbed the Death Ray, or Teleforce. According to Tesla himself, it wasn't a laser or ray weapon in the usual sense. It was a device, a kind of electric gun, capable of accelerating a beam of microscopic tungsten or mercury particles to near light speed. Such a beam, he claimed, would not disperse in the atmosphere and could shoot down an armada of 10,000 enemy airplanes from hundreds of miles away, or annihilate an entire army. He offered his invention to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. But he didn't see it as a weapon of aggression, but as the ultimate weapon of peace. He sincerely believed that if every country had such an impenetrable shield of force, any war would be meaningless. But no one took him seriously. His blueprints were considered the delusions of an old genius who had lost his mind, and none of his death ray projects were funded. He also worked on creating artificial earthquakes, developing a compact but powerful electromechanical oscillator. There is a semi-legendary story of how, while testing a small prototype of this device, about the size of an alarm clock, in his New York laboratory, he accidentally entered into resonance with the structure of the building. The vibration intensified. In the laboratory, the plaster began to peel off the walls, and the glass began to vibrate. Then, the entire building began to shake, and the neighboring buildings too. The police began receiving calls about an earthquake. Tesla, realizing what was happening, panicked, grabbed a hammer, and smashed the device to pieces a second before. According to his own words, the entire building collapsed. But the deeper he delved into his brilliant but disconnected from reality projects, the more lonely and isolated he became. His old friends and partners, like Westinghouse, were dying off. His fame as the genius victor of the War of the Currents faded into obscurity, giving way to the image of a harmless but strange eccentric. He barely interacted with anyone except for business matters, and his only true, almost pathological attachment in these final years were the pigeons. Every day, no matter the weather, he went to Bryant Park to feed them. He knew them all by sight. He gave them names, talked to them. If he saw a sick or injured bird, he would carefully take it to his hotel room. He could spend thousands of dollars, which he didn't have, calling a veterinarian or building a special support structure for a pigeon with a broken wing. The hotel management was horrified, but tolerated it, not daring to evict the living legend. His luxurious room, full of blueprints and books, was often also full of pigeons. This strange and tender affection for the birds was his only escape, his only family. According to his own shocking words, he fell in love with a pigeon, a white pigeon with grey spots on her wings, as a man loves a woman. He claimed they communicated telepathically, and that it was she who, flying to his window one night, with a light emanating from her eyes, brought him the news that his work on Earth was done and that he would soon die. The world considered him definitely crazy, but once a year, on his birthday, he loudly reminded them of his existence. He would call a grand press conference in the hotel ballroom, which, for old time's sake, journalists from the major media outlets still attended. And at these conferences, the old genius, incredibly thin, elegantly dressed, but with a feverish gleam in his eyes, would make his latest sensational and fantastic declarations. He talked about his death rays, his communication with Martians, the possibility of controlling the weather, of photographing thoughts. The newspapers published these articles with ironic and condescending headlines, and the public read them as a funny anecdote about a nutty professor. No one could, or wanted to, believe anymore that behind these seemingly demented statements hid the very same grandiose and lucid mind that had given the world alternating current, the radio, fluorescent lamps, and the foundations of all modern electrical engineering. He lived in his own future world, while the real world simply passed him by, without noticing him. He was too great, too strange, too different for his time, and he was absolutely, immeasurably, and tragically alone. The last years of Nikola Tesla's life passed in almost total and absolute isolation. In room 3327, on the 33rd floor of the Hotel New Yorker, he lived in the world of his thoughts, of his complex mathematical calculations inaccessible to others, of his blueprints and his memories. He had become a ghost of New York, tall, incredibly thin, almost skeletal, dressed in elegant but worn-out suits from the last century. He rarely left his refuge. He moved through the streets like a shadow, always along the same route, to the park, to feed his only friends, the pigeons, and to the public library. He lived under a strict, almost monastic regime. His eccentricities, which before seemed like the quirks of a genius, had become a true obsession. He had a panic fear of germs. He constantly washed his hands, wiped his cutlery until it shone, and used dozens of napkins in a single meal. He hated round objects, especially women's pearl earrings. He was obsessed with the number 3 and all its multiples. Before entering a building, he had to walk around the block 3 times. At the hotel, he demanded that exactly 18 clean towels be brought to him every day. He ate very modestly, almost ascetically, convinced that this prolonged his life and sharpened his mind. He barely interacted with anyone. He lived in his ivory tower, and that tower was his own mind. Brilliant, but so lonely. In early January 1943, at the height of World War II, while the world burned in a fire that he, perhaps, could have prevented with his weapon of peace, Tesla, 86 years old, hung the "Do Not Disturb" sign on his hotel room door as usual. The maid, accustomed to his oddities, didn't dare to enter for several days. But on January 7th, not having seen him for too long, she violated the ban and entered the room. Nikola Tesla lay in his bed. He was dressed in a formal and elegant suit, as if preparing for an important meeting. His long, aristocratic hands were carefully crossed over his chest. He was dead. He died silently, in his sleep, from a coronary thrombosis. Alone. In a hotel room he had no money to pay for. But the story didn't end there. On the contrary, its most enigmatic chapter had just begun. As soon as his death became known, it wasn't his relatives, his friends, or the journalists who immediately arrived at the hotel. The first to arrive were FBI agents. By direct order of the United States government, his entire room was sealed. Officials from the Office of Alien Property, since Tesla had never formally become a US citizen, opened his safe. All his papers, all his notebooks, all his blueprints, all his scientific archives that he had accumulated over more than half a century, were confiscated in the interest of national security. The government was terrified. Of what? That his developments, especially the blueprints of the famous death ray he had talked about so much in his final years, could fall into the wrong hands, into the hands of the enemies, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. There were rumors that Tesla had already been in negotiations with them. The confiscated files, several boxes of documents, were handed over to a secret committee that included, among others, John Trump, a famous MIT physicist and, by a twist of fate, uncle of the future President of the United States, Donald Trump. After several weeks of studying the papers, the committee issued an official and reassuring conclusion. Tesla's ideas were of a speculative, philosophical, and theoretical nature, and presented no practical value for military applications in the near future. Most of the archives were, later, after long legal battles, handed over to his only heir, his nephew, Sava Kosanovic, and are now kept in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, open to researchers. But a considerable part of the documents, classified as top secret, remained in the archives of the US intelligence services. This act of state confiscation and the subsequent classification gave rise to countless and relentless conspiracy theories that the government actually found, hid, and possibly even used his most revolutionary and fantastic inventions. Tesla's funeral was modest, but it finally brought together the few who understood the true magnitude of his genius. At the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, more than 2,000 people gathered: scientists, engineers, diplomats, Nobel laureates. The mayor of New York read a farewell speech. Serbian funeral music, played on the violin, was broadcast over the radio. But to the general public, he died in the same way he had lived his final years, almost unnoticed. It seemed that official history, written by the victors, had simply erased his name. Edison went down in the textbooks as the father of electricity, Marconi as the inventor of the radio, and the name of Tesla, the man who actually created the entire modern alternating current system and obtained the key patents for the radio long before Marconi, was almost forgotten for decades. But as in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, his true and mythical immortality began much later. In the second half of the 20th century, with the rise of the counterculture, the advent of the internet, and the disillusionment with official science, his triumphant, almost messianic return began. People looking for alternative paths rediscovered this strange, forgotten, and slandered genius. He became an icon for all the misunderstood, for all the loners, for all those who believed that the world is not ruled by solitary geniuses, but by greedy corporations and secret conspiracies. His name became a symbol, the symbol of selfless service to science, as opposed to Edison's greedy and pragmatic business. The symbol of the free and ethereal energy that is supposedly hidden from us. The symbol of the solitary genius who spoke with the cosmos and dreamed of a utopia but was destroyed by the system. And today, his real, non-mythical legacy is everywhere in every single one of our days. Every outlet in your house runs on his polyphase alternating current system. Every time you turn on the radio, the TV remote, use your mobile phone or a fluorescent lamp, you are using the principles he discovered. Wi-Fi, drones, radio-controlled devices. It all stems from his ideas, from his laboratory. Even the most famous and expensive electric car company today, Tesla, bears his name as a late tribute to the man who started the entire modern electrical revolution. So, who was he? A mad scientist who talked to pigeons? A naive dreamer who didn't know how to count money? Or a misunderstood prophet who really could have changed the world, but the world wasn't ready? Perhaps a little bit of everything. But one thing is undeniable. He was a man who thought not in years, but in centuries. He lived in his own electrical and wireless future, a future that for us is just beginning. And his story is an eternal and tragic reminder that the path of the genius is often a path of inexpressible loneliness, and that the brightest and most dazzling flashes of light are born in the deepest and most impenetrable darkness. If you found this journey into the mind of Nikola Tesla as fascinating as I did, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this brilliant and misunderstood inventor.